Muy buenas tardes, embajadora, bienvenida al Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales, embajadora de Canadá. Es un verdadero placer recibirla aquí en la sede del Centro. Creo que es la primera vez que nos visitaba, así que la verdad es que, como digo, un verdadero placer y espero que no sea la última, que nos visite con toda la frecuencia que quiera. Nosotros estaremos encantados. Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a todos a este acto de esta tarde, a la conferencia que vamos a escuchar del profesor Jean-Francois Gaudreault-DesBiens. Buenas tardes, profesor. También bienvenido al Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales. Será introducido y presentado también por nuestro compañero, nuestro colega Eduardo Ruiz Vieytez. Es vicerrector de Estrategias Universitarias de la Universidad de Deusto. También encantada de recibirte en nuestra sede. Y también bienvenidas, como decía, y bienvenidos a todos los que están aquí en la sede del Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales y a todos los que nos siguen también a través de los medios telemáticos. Nosotros estamos realmente ilusionados con la colaboración que vamos a comenzar con la Embajada de Canadá y sobre todo con la Fundación Canadá también. Y esta colaboración espero que se materialice en encuentros, en colaboraciones, en debates, en seminarios, en todo tipo de actividades que puedan enriquecer nuestras instituciones respectivas. Querida embajadora, te daría la palabra ahora, si tienes a bien dirigirnos alguna comunicación.
Bueno, muchas gracias, estimada directora Yolanda Gómez. Gracias por acogernos aquí esta tarde en su casa, en su lindísima casa, impresionante. Y déjeme en primer lugar empezar dándole gracias a la directora de la Fundación Pluralismo y Convivencia, Inés Mazarrasa, también por su colaboración en la organización de esta conferencia. Y por supuesto a nuestra queridísima Marisa Calés, directora de la Fundación Canadá. El debate de esta noche trata aspectos importantes de la diversidad y la inclusión, un tema de importancia tanto para Canadá como para España. La diversidad y la inclusión y cómo las apoyamos y promovemos son prioridades para nuestros dos gobiernos, no solo dentro de nuestros países, sino también en nuestras políticas exteriores. Y una de las formas en que podemos avanzar es reuniéndonos y compartiendo ideas y perspectivas, exactamente lo que estamos haciendo esta tarde. En este sentido, estamos en las mejores manos con un académico de la talla del profesor Jean-Francois Gaudreault-DesBiens y un experto como el profesor Eduardo Ruiz Vieytez. Professeur Gaudreault-DesBiens, il est un grand plaisir de vous avoir ici parmi nous ce soir. Bienvenue. Este encuentro es una ocasión magnífica para descubrir aquellas similitudes, retos y preguntas a las que la sociedad canadiense y española se enfrentan con respecto a este tema esencial y sensible de nuestras sociedades, la gestión de la diversidad religiosa. Espero que esta presentación ilumine algunas ideas, anime a debatir sobre este asunto entre expertos de ambos países y que enriquezca nuestras culturas, haciendo sentir bien a los diversos miembros de nuestras sociedades. No quiero terminar sin subrayar nuestra satisfacción por la relación de colaboración que se inicia entre nuestra Embajada, la Fundación Canadá y el Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales, que se va a plasmar en un acuerdo de colaboración entre ambas entidades en un futuro próximo. Esta casa es un lugar de encuentro para debatir temas esenciales de nuestros dos países y nos hace muy felices poder establecer una línea de trabajo conjunta que fomente estudios en materia jurídica y constitucional de nuestros dos países. Creo que podemos aprender mucho unos de los otros. Bueno, directora, espero que esto sea el inicio de una larga amistad y historia de cooperación entre nuestras dos instituciones. Sin más, cedo la palabra a los protagonistas de la jornada, el profesor Ruiz Vieytez y el profesor Gaudreault-DesBiens. Muchas gracias. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a la embajadora por sus palabras. A continuación, nosotros dejamos la mesa para facilitar que sea el ponente y el relator el que puedan tomar asiento.
Buenas tardes a todas y a todos y, en primer lugar, cómo no, agradecer la organización de esta conferencia, de esta jornada. Es un placer estar aquí en el Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales. Muchísimas gracias por albergar este evento y, cómo no, también a la Embajada de Canadá, a la Fundación Canadá y a la Fundación Pluralismo y Convivencia por darnos la oportunidad de estar hoy aquí, de poder debatir y de poder disfrutar básicamente de la ponencia del profesor y colega Jean-Francois Gaudreault-DesBiens. A mí me han encargado que haga una introducción o enmarcar levemente la ponencia de nuestro invitado principal, y simplemente intentaré plantear o poner sobre la mesa algunas cuestiones o algunas reflexiones previas que pudieran orientar. En primer lugar, con una cierta perspectiva histórica, comprobar o recordar que en los años 60, en los años 70, cuando en Europa básicamente, también en otros países, se discutían las ciencias sociales sobre integración y había movimientos migratorios internacionales, había sociedades que se diversificaban. Tenemos muchísima literatura, muchas referencias en ciencias sociales y, sin embargo, una escasísima presencia de alusiones a las cuestiones religiosas o a las identidades religiosas. Esto, como sabemos, va evolucionando y va cambiando, de tal manera que se produce una cierta reemergencia, por lo menos de las cuestiones ligadas a la religión, en la agenda pública, que va tomando cada vez un mayor protagonismo. Todos podemos entender que la religión, las religiones, en sus diversas modalidades, constituyen un hecho y un fenómeno socialmente muy relevante y, por tanto, también afectan a los derechos y libertades de los ciudadanos y ciudadanas. Y, por tanto, tienen que ser incorporados en la lectura que de esos derechos cada ordenamiento jurídico y cada Estado tiene que realizar. Y el gran reto es la universalización de derechos en clave seguramente asimétrica, en clave inclusiva y en clave plural al mismo tiempo. Además, desde el punto de vista jurídico, la protección de las creencias y de la religión se ha fundamentado, se ha organizado en torno a diversos derechos. Tenemos, obviamente, la libertad de religión, que seguramente está en el origen, o es uno de los embriones, al menos, de lo que luego posteriormente se configuraría como derechos humanos. Seguramente tiene mucho que ver la Reforma Protestante, tiene mucho que ver el humanismo del siglo XVI, incluso también el encuentro con América, para entender lo que es la alteridad y para incorporar la alteridad a las relaciones humanas y, por tanto, el sentido de libertad, no ya de tolerancia, sino también de libertad de conciencia. Y seguramente la Reforma Protestante es un actor protagonista que alumbra unos primeros instrumentos jurídicos, a veces domésticos y a veces internacionales, en los cuales va emergiendo la libertad de religión, la libertad de conciencia, pero expresada sobre todo en clave de libertad de religión, para grupos concretos, para momentos concretos y para geografías concretas, pero que van avanzando lo que más tarde sería una protección mucho más universalizada, al menos en clave nominal. Hoy en día la libertad de religión está en todos los tratados internacionales de derechos humanos. Pero tenemos, por un lado, la libertad de religión, tenemos, por otro lado, el derecho a no ser discriminado por razón de religión, y tenemos, por otro lado, en algunos tratados, el derecho de las personas pertenecientes a minorías religiosas de profesar su propia religión. Por ejemplo, en el Pacto Internacional de Derechos Civiles y Políticos o en el Convenio de los Derechos del Niño. La interacción entre estos tres derechos no siempre es nítida, no siempre es clara, y seguramente hay trabajo jurídico para hacer para delimitar el ámbito de protección de cada uno de ellos, pero también delimitar ¿A qué nos referimos exactamente? ¿A qué nos podemos referir cuando hablamos de minorías religiosas y incorporamos estos tratados en nuestro ordenamiento jurídico? Son parte del ordenamiento jurídico. A ello añadimos que en todos los estados tenemos gobernanzas multinivel, hay varios niveles institucionales, pero en este sentido Canadá y España comparten, al menos en líneas gruesas, comparten una estructura territorial con una estructura también de gobierno que otorga competencias y poderes a diversos niveles políticos y administrativos. Nos interesa especialmente esta cuestión porque también se está realizando un trabajo importante desde la Fundación Pluralismo y Convivencia, del Gobierno de España, para que, y de la Federación Española de Municipios y Provincias, para que los municipios de este país gestionen la diversidad religiosa de la manera más eficaz, más democrática posible. Y, por tanto, los municipios también son agentes activos en la gestión de la diversidad religiosa y, por supuesto, también las comunidades autónomas y el Gobierno central. Algo que, bueno, en Canadá también hay estos niveles de gobierno, con las diferencias de ambos países, pero hay muchas similitudes y, por tanto, queremos también conocer un poco más la organización que en Canadá y en las diversas provincias de Canadá se produce en este sentido. Por tanto, Canadá es un país que nos interesa por muchas razones, pero también en cuanto a este tema citaré tres cuestiones o tres claves, tres elementos que me parece que son relevantes en esta tarde. Por una parte, lo que se haya repetido muchas veces, Canadá es el primer país que hace una apuesta política formal por el multiculturalismo ya hace más de 50 años. Ese multiculturalismo canadiense que después en Quebec se expresa o se adopta una opción por el interculturalismo. Estos dos conceptos seguramente en clave europea y académica europea no significan lo mismo o exactamente lo mismo que están queriendo expresar en Canadá o en el segundo caso en Quebec, pero dan lugar a debates, yo creo, muy fructíferos en los cuales también cada uno de nosotros también mantenemos nuestras posiciones, pero creo que Canadá sigue siendo un referente y un país evidentemente a tener en cuenta en todo este debate sobre la crisis o supuesta crisis del multiculturalismo y la nueva apuesta por una opción más intercultural. En segundo lugar, otro elemento que creo que es relevante es que la Carta de Derechos y Libertades canadiense, incorporada en la repatriación de la Constitución del año 1982, incorpora una sección, un artículo, número 27, que es la cláusula multicultural. No encontraremos un artículo en ninguna Constitución europea, en las casi 50 constituciones europeas no encontraremos un artículo equiparable a lo que dice la sección 27 de la Carta de Derechos y Libertades. ¿Hasta dónde esta sección, cuál es la potencialidad jurídica de esta sección? Es algo que se puede discutir, es algo que quizás también se puede aludir a ello en la conferencia. Yo tuve la suerte de que esta misma casa, en una de sus revistas, la revista española de Derecho Constitucional, me publicara un artículo sobre la jurisprudencia canadiense del artículo 27, que necesita ser actualizado porque fue hace ya 15 años. Entonces, bueno, el recorrido de esa sección 27, en aquel momento limitado, podríamos ver hasta dónde ofrece juego también para la gestión de la diversidad religiosa. Y, por último, cómo no aludir al concepto de la cómoda razonable, que aunque de origen estadounidense se incorpora en Canadá y lo conocemos básicamente en la gestión de la diversidad religiosa. Y hemos discutido mucho sobre la posible incorporación a ordenamientos europeos de este concepto, sobre su posible utilización tanto en clave interna como en clave del Sistema Regional Europeo de Protección de Derechos Humanos, y también hay ideas y conclusiones diferentes. Para hablar de todo esto y de muchas más cosas, pues mi colega, el profesor Jean-Francois Gaudreault-DesBiens, está con nosotros. Es un placer tenerle aquí. Él es vicerrector de Planificación y Comunicación Estratégica de la Universidad de Montreal. Fue también decano de la Facultad de Derecho, ha tenido varios cargos y una larga y contrastada, seria trayectoria académica que puede verse en las publicaciones que tiene, no solamente en francés y en inglés, sino en varios idiomas. Además, participa activamente con otros grupos de investigación fuera de Canadá, lo cual puedo dar fe de ello porque nos hemos encontrado en diversos sitios. concretamente con los institutos Max Planck, si no me equivoco, de Halle, de Antropología Jurídica y Social, o el de Göttingen, sobre religiones, y otros centros. Así que, bueno, estamos deseando escuchar la ponencia y sin más preámbulos le doy la palabra. Gracias.
Gracias, estimado colega Eduardo. Excelencia. Me gustaría agradecer a la Fundación Pluralismo y Convivencia y la Fundación Canadá, Marisa, por su invitación. Yo soy consciente de mis límites en español. Puedo entender español, pero para hablar es un poco más difícil. Entonces, no quiero destruir sus orejas y daré mi conferencia en inglés, si no es un problema. My presentation will have two parts. You have the notes for the first part, which is essentially deals with the constitutional history and the normative ecosystem in which municipalities, because that will be the focus in the second part of my talk, evolve. So there are things that they can do, there are things that they cannot do. So the first part will deal with this normative ecosystem. And the second part, I will rather focus on practices and strategies on the ground, formal and informal, that are adopted or elaborated by municipalities, by the administration of boroughs within municipalities, by community groups, to help ease relations between various groups and between religious groups, religious and less religious groups, and religious groups and groups who do not really like religion, because we have these issues as well. So that will be the second part of my talk. I'm just trying to, do I need to? Okay. So it will be a kind of socio-legal analysis of this question. Let me start by saying a few things about the Canada's constitutional history with a focus on how religion unfolded. As you know, Canada was not terra nullius when Europeans landed on its shores. There were a number of First Nations, indigenous peoples with rich spiritualities. But obviously, when the European landed, it was true in the United States, it was true in Latin America, it was true in New France. They were not that much interested by what these first peoples had to say and what they believed in, because they were pagans. So the idea was to evangelize indigenous groups. I will return to this question a bit later. So on the territory that is now Canada, the first European power that took possession, so to say, of the land was the Kingdom of France. The colony of Acadia and then the colony of New France were created, and these were Roman Catholic colonies. And it's interesting to know that in New France, non-Catholics could not migrate from France to New France. So this might be a reason why Huguenots, after religious persecution, had to flee to London, to Amsterdam. They could not come to New France, unlike the Puritans in the US with the Mayflower, and you know the history. So it was a Roman Catholic colony, which obviously was impacted when the British conquered the colony after the 7 Years' War. And this created a clash between the new British subjects, who were entirely Roman Catholics, and the new administration, which was Anglican, anti-Papist. So what the rules that applied then in England applied in Canada as well. And among those rules was the test oath. Basically, Roman Catholics had to abjure their religion so as to be able to work in the public service. In 1774, with the Quebec Act, this was repealed, and they could eventually participate in the administration of the colony, although most of them were illiterate. So there were very few of them participating, most of the elite having left New France after the British conquest. Then the American Revolution adds a layer of complexity, and by and large explains, or in part at least, what Canada was to become. There was a large influx of loyalists who were also Protestant. And obviously when they moved into Canada in the province of Quebec, as the British called it, they settled west. There were clashes as well between Papist and non-Papist, or Catholic and Protestant. And eventually this led to a division of the territory in two divisions: Lower Canada, which is today's Quebec, and Upper Canada, which is today's Ontario. Those two colonies were united in 1840 with a goal to assimilate, basically, the French speakers. It failed. I'm there, so clearly it failed. Now, the modern history of Canada begins more or less in 1867, when the Westminster Parliament united 4 colonies in British North America: Quebec, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And it is in that constitutional act that the federal division of powers that we are still living with together was elaborated and enshrined. Eventually, further layers of constitutional instruments were enacted, the most important of which, and Eduardo alluded to it, being the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, which, as I will elaborate on a bit later, incorporated freedom of religion. It's not that freedom of religion did not exist before, but it was not an enshrined fundamental right. It was protected by the common law, but that protection was precarious, so to say. Now, first thing to remember, for quite a while, probably until World War II, the Roman Catholic versus Protestant divide was a major political variable in the political evolution of Canada. Between 1867 and World War II, there was lots of immigration in Canada, and immigration from religious groups. For example, there were a number of Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire then, fleeing pogroms. There were a number of Anabaptist Christians, like Utarites, Mennonites, and so on and so forth, settling, for most of them, in Western Canada, but bringing with them visions, cultural visions that did not necessarily fit with, within the legal system, within the mindset of the majority. For example, their relation to property. The idea of communal property was not something that Protestants or even Roman Catholics were used to. More recently, patterns of immigration have changed. Nowadays, there is everywhere in Canada a significant influx of people who profess the Sikh religion, Hindu religion, basically Eastern or Asian religion, and Muslims. And as in many other countries in the world, especially in continental Europe, there are, I would say, challenges of convivencia. And last thing that I want to mention, between 1867 and more or less 1982, or let's be charitable, 1960, the goal was to assimilate First Peoples, to marginalize them, to put them on reserves, and to assimilate them to the extent possible with residential schools operated by, generally speaking, the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican or Presbyterian Church. And the goal was assimilation, was basically the erasure of Aboriginal culture, including Aboriginal spiritualities. And some practices, like the potlatch on the West Coast, were literally forbidden. They were criminalized. So you see, when we're talking about Aboriginal spiritualities, the status of such spiritualities was very precarious for quite a long time. Now, this is the preamble. Let me briefly talk about three main axes that are relevant to the protection of religious minorities in Canada. The first one is what I call the implicit constitutional axis. The second one is the federalism axis, and the third one is the right axis. And obviously, when we are thinking about the normative ecosystem within which municipalities evolve, we have to take into consideration these questions. Briefly, in the Constitution Act 1867, the preamble mentions that Canada was to have a constitution similar in principle to the United Kingdom. And when trying to deal with some challenges to laws that were allegedly violating fundamental freedoms such as freedom of religion, for a little while, the Supreme Court of Canada used that preamble to elaborate the doctrine of the implied Bill of Rights, which it used to shield minorities from abusive governmental action. But it was a very uneven tool, or a tool that could work in some situations, but not always. So again, the protection of minorities was rather precarious. That doctrine was later rejected in the 1970s. Yet it was to some extent revived through the Supreme Court of Canada's recognition of the existence of implicit constitutional principle in a case that is very, very famous in Spain, the Quebec secession reference. I have given a number of talks in Spain about this case. But again, the so-called promise of these principles, I think, has been largely tamed by further decisions of the Supreme Court. I will return to that later, as it is particularly relevant to municipalities. The second axis that I want to mention is federalism. The first thing that you have to know is that provinces are responsible for legislating over areas of local interest, but very important areas in people's daily lives: education, healthcare, microeconomic power, and municipalities. And as a matter of principle, private law, for the most part, is something that falls under provincial jurisdiction as part of property and civil rights. And one of the reasons it was allocated to provinces was because in 1867, well, not only the province of Quebec, which was a major player, had a private law derived from French law, but also it was a Roman Catholic province. So if you give power to the provinces over private law, you give them power over family law, personal status law. And obviously, the province wanted Roman Catholic, I would say, preconceptions that were reflected in the civil code to be protected. So this is why, by and large, property and civil rights was attributed as a topic to provinces. Then the federal parliament was allocated, I would say, macroscopic jurisdiction. Criminal law, but also marriage and divorce. Why is that? Because in that case, the framers of the Constitution wanted to I would say, assuage or to reduce the potential influence of the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec about divorce and the conditions for marriage, even though in practice, divorce was only legalized a century later by Prime Minister Trudeau, the father of the current Trudeau Prime Minister. One thing that you must know is that before the enactment of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, the federal division of powers was sometimes relied upon to challenge laws or regulations that were oppressive to religious minorities. And various provinces have, well, had oppressed or tried to suppress the religious rights of minorities. In Quebec, there was an issue in the 40s, 50s with Jehovah's Witnesses. In the West, it was the Utarites, and so on and so forth. So provincial action, sometimes provincial legislations were adopted, and they were challenged on the basis of either the federal parliament's power over criminal law or its general power to make laws for peace, order, and good government. And then the Supreme Court, in a certain number of cases, decided indeed that legislation pertaining to religion fell under the jurisdiction of the federal government. And therefore, provincial attempts at reducing religious rights were unconstitutional. This approach has faded and is probably no more valid law. But it is right now in a challenge of a Quebec legislation, the Laicity Act. Some people are trying to revive that doctrine. We will see how it goes. Another question that is relatively important to note is that there was a deal, to some extent, between the two main religious groups in 1867, with special educational rights granted to minority religion, Roman Catholics in Ontario and Protestant in the province of Quebec, having the right to have a publicly funded school network. And although in Quebec this was secularized in 1997, well, you mentioned Stéphane Dion. He was the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, so he's partly responsible for that. In Ontario, the system still remains. So you have the public school system, which is secular, and you have a Catholic stream, which still exists. Now, let's talk about the status of municipalities. Municipalities are very important actors in the daily lives of citizens. It is with this level of government that citizens interact the most. Yet, from a constitutional law standpoint, they are mere creatures of provincial legislature. So it means that they are under the absolute jurisdiction of provinces. Their powers are delegated by the province to them, and this means that a province can decide to withdraw that delegation or to reduce the powers of the municipality. So you have a level of government that is essential, but that is subordinated for all legal purposes. Recently, in 2021, there was a kind of unilateral change to the charter of the City of Toronto, and the City of Toronto was not really happy about that, but it was imposed unilaterally by the Ontario government, and it was challenged by the city. And the municipality tried to level the implicit constitutional principle of democracy to fight that legislation. But the Supreme Court said that the principle in question could not override the clear allocation of jurisdiction to provinces over municipalities. So the idea of reviving in one way or another a kind of implied Bill of Rights is something that is not really realistic. But what is important to remember at this stage is that irrespective of recent provincial laws in many provinces that describe municipalities as governments of proximity, they have no legal recourse if their powers are reduced. It is very important. Now, let me say a few words about what I call the rights protection ecosystem and the Charter of Rights and Freedom, which applies to governmental action of which municipalities are a part. So the Charter of Rights applies to municipalities. Essentially, there is a rights adjudication structure that is very similar to that which exists under the European Convention of Human Rights. So if a violation is found to exist, it can be saved if it is demonstrated that, well, the violation comes from a rule that was prescribed by a rule of law, and is reasonable in a free and democratic society, which implies the recognition that the objective that is sought after by the government, which is legislating, is legitimate, that it has taken reasonable, rational means to achieve that objective, that it tries to minimally impair the rights, religious rights, for example, of those targeted by the legislation, and there's the proportionality test. I won't go further on this. One thing that is very important, and Eduardo alluded to the multiculturalism clause of the Charter of Rights, section 27. It is extremely important, I would say, for the constitutional identity of Canadians. There was initially the Canadian Multiculturalism Act, which was enacted by the first Trudeau government in the early 1970s. But it applied only to the federal government and its and some organizations that are under the jurisdiction of the federal government. But this is a principle of interpretation. So it does not create any substantive right, ex proprio vigore, as we say in Latin, in and of itself. So it means that if a religious group were to say there's an overlap between my religious worldview and a culture, that religious group would not be able, without referring to freedom of conscience or freedom of religion, to ground its claim on the multiculturalism clause. It is only an interpretive principle, but which has had a major impact on Canadian constitutional culture, on Canadian constitutional identity. I will return to that in a few minutes. Just to say that the approach to freedom of religion, which is entrenched in the Charter of Rights, is rather liberal. It only requires a claimant to demonstrate that he has a sincere belief into something, so it's a subjective test, and that a law, some form of governmental action has affected the way he or she can live, basically. I will not go into details. It is in the PowerPoint. And there is that being said, there is an evidentiary threshold that is not, that has to be taken into consideration. This concept of freedom of religion is important because it imposes upon the state, including municipalities, a duty of religious neutrality. When we're thinking about that duty of religious neutrality, let me just mention a case that was decided 7 years ago, which involved a Roman Catholic prayer which was recited during municipal councils. And the Supreme Court found that this recital of a Christian prayer violated the freedom of religion of other religious groups, of agnostics, of atheists, and this was found unconstitutional. This on the basis of state neutrality. So the idea is that you have to include in the way you function as a municipality. That is a rather important precedent. Now, there is also a prohibition of discrimination based on religion in Section 15 of the Canadian Charter. And this gave rise to the doctrine of reasonable accommodation. So if one can demonstrate that prima facie he or she is discriminated by some rule, directly or indirectly, a norm that can present itself as neutral, facially neutral, that person may be entitled to an accommodation either by, well, for example, by his employer. And if a person has that prima facie right to be accommodated, then the burden of proof shifts to the employer, to the government, the person from whom the accommodation is requested, and that person or that organization has to demonstrate that accepting the accommodation would impose upon itself an undue constraint. So it's a very substantive burden. And the same rule exists in the US, but the burden of proof is not as high in the US. So this applies to municipalities, for example, regarding their employees. Now, enough law. Let's talk about some societal variables. Canada is a country of immigration. I think it's fair to say that, well, there are two main societal cultures, and I'm using Will Kimlicka's famous expression here, societal culture, in which people, with which they interact. So if you're a religious migrant, you will somehow be welcome in one of those two societal cultures. They're not separated by watertight compartment. They share a lot of things, but in some respects, especially with respect to attitudes toward religions, there are differences. And I'm speaking about the French-speaking societal culture, essentially based in Quebec, and the English-speaking societal culture elsewhere. And there are very distinct visions of multiculturalism. As I mentioned, I think that it's fair to say that multiculturalism has come to define the identity in English-speaking Canada to a large extent. In Quebec, it's different because multiculturalism from the outset has been seen by many people as an attempt to dissolve Quebec's historic national identity rooted in the French culture. And so the doctrine or the theory of interculturalism was elaborated, where the idea is that there is a dominant culture which is French-speaking and which integrate, not assimilate, but which integrates or seeks to integrate people from different cultural horizons and religious horizons. In practice, on the ground, is there a big difference? The answer is no. All sociological studies are quite clear about that. Clearly, the legal treatment of the religious fact provides an interaction where sometimes the majorities in the rest of Canada and Quebec collide. And this can be explained by each societal culture's historical trajectory. In Quebec, you have an essentially Roman Catholic province which secularized at a very fast pace as of the 1960s, but where there is still resentment, not only against Roman Catholicism, but against religion in general. And if you add on top of this, I would say, the inter-influence between France and Quebec, it is not a surprise to see many people in Quebec subscribing to a form of laïcité à la française, which was recently legislated in the Laïcité Act in Quebec and which is challenged before courts of law. I will not enter into details. Outside of Quebec, there was no such domination by any church. It was much more plural at the outset. So you don't have this kind of defiance, if not outright hostility towards religion. So I think it accounts to some extent for different attitudes. And in a way, I guess that the approach to religion in outside of Quebec is much closer to that exists in the United Kingdom. It's part of life. It's not a problem to have religious people manifesting their creed in the public sphere. But it's viewed quite differently by many people in the province of Quebec. And the legal ecosystem and the constitutional ecosystem, I would say, crystallized those differences with a certain number of cases that were decided by the Supreme Court of Canada in the year 2000, mid-2000s. One case dealing with the erection of a sukkah on the balcony of a condominium in the neighborhood of Outremont in Montreal. And the Supreme Court adopted this very subjective conception of freedom of religion and recognized that an observant Jew could erect a sukkah on his balcony in spite of the declaration of co-ownership, basically the contract, where he had renounced that right. Interestingly, the same year, the Cour de Cassation in France, in a case called Amselem, with the exact same fact, made a completely different decision. The declaration of ownership, the contract, prevailed over the freedom of religion of this other Mr. Amselem. No surprise. Another case that created an uproar was the Multani case, where you had a pupil at a public school which was recognized the right to be accommodated to enter the school premises with a kirpan, which is the ritual knives that the Sikh believers wear. Elsewhere in Canada, it would not have been a problem, but it was a problem in Quebec, and it was instrumentalized by some political parties, more right-wing, let's face it, to say that Canadian multiculturalism was toxic, basically. And you had the famous Bouchard-Taylor Commission that was set up and said that it's not really a big problem when you look at the data. But since then, we have been living in the province of Quebec with this. Now, let me talk about municipalities. I will not. I will go directly to my second part, and I'm just going to. Okay. Here, to talk about what I call the municipal paradox in Canada. Recall that municipalities, as I said, are subordinated to their masters, the provinces. But in practice, there is a disconnect between the constitutional status of municipalities and their actual social role. They are frontline providers of essential services. It is in large urban centers where immigration and diversity and religious diversity is by and large concentrated. And in practice, there's what I call a kind of concrete dumping of federal and provincial responsibilities on municipalities. This in a context where, as in many countries, you see that in the United States, you see that in many European countries, there is a kind of attitudinal divide between large urban centers and regions towards diversity and towards religious diversity. For example, I alluded to the Laicity Act in Quebec. Opposition to this statute is much higher in Montreal than elsewhere in Quebec, in more rural or homogeneous areas. So on the ground, from a normative standpoint, municipalities can regulate indirectly religious groups, religious minorities, and so on and so forth, through zoning bylaws, the interpretation of which is often a source of tension. So it can concern places of worship, the location of cemeteries, and so on and so forth. And sometimes there is a position, and we're not necessarily in the legal sphere, but a position by local people to some claims that are made by the citizens of municipalities. For example, a few years ago in the Quebec City area, the Muslim community wanted to have a Muslim cemetery. And it was a real problem to find a municipality which accepted to have a Muslim cemetery. And, well, again, this is now a famous case study, but it took the leadership of then Quebec City mayor to say, no, I'm going to find the Muslim community a cemetery. This in a context where there had been an assassination, a mass assassination at the Quebec City Mosque. So you see that these debates are very heated, not only in Europe, but also in Quebec. It's less heated in the rest of Canada, but I was reading yesterday that it's in Ontario that in the Western world there have been the highest number of or Islamophobic aggressions lately. So there's an issue. But I've mentioned the regulatory powers through zoning bylaws, for example, that municipalities have at their disposal if they want to do something. And obviously, there are parameters within which they can do something, but they cannot do spot zoning to discriminate against religious group. Now, the most fruitful initiatives are not legal. They're not about regulation. They're about sociability. How can you create or facilitate sociability between groups in your community? By creating, for example, hospitable public spaces. How can you enhance the sense of belonging of religious minorities? It's not done through law. For example, municipalities have elaborated strategies to speak to religious groups and to, generally speaking, groups that are more likely to be victims of discrimination. It's about organizing, showing some leadership. I mentioned this intervention by the mayor of Quebec City, who managed to find a piece of land for a Muslim cemetery. So organizing the interaction and the action of the municipality when it is faced with claims by religious groups. Let me talk about briefly a few good practices and potential actions that municipalities, and basically I've looked at Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, which are the largest centers, urban centers in Canada. It's also where most of religious diversity is to be found. What are municipalities doing on the ground? Well, all of them are trying through information campaigns to ease the relations between groups. They have adopted declarations on convivencia. They have adopted action plans for the way that their own services are delivered. And sometimes this may impact on how religious groups are treated and how their claims can be, I would say, understood by other citizens. They have created municipal organizations or municipal offices that deal with this. For example, in Montreal, a few years ago, a position was created, which is basically commissioner on anti-racism, and racism here is understood or construed liberally. It includes obviously racism against religious groups. They have elaborated consultation mechanism, and in practice, for example, these consultation mechanisms have to be, I would say, have to take into consideration the context in which they are to be applied. In a large municipality, the diversity issues may vary. You have different religious groups, you have different ethnic groups, but you have different religious groups, and you do not necessarily interact with a minority Sikh group the way you interact with a minority Muslim group. Even though the legal parameters are the same, you want these initiatives, these strategies, these actions to succeed on the ground. So there are citizens' forums that are created so as to make sure, so as to facilitate mutual understanding between people of different worldviews, of different creeds at the local level. And it can play a very positive role. Again, for example, this neighborhood in Montreal of Outremont is home to a very large Hasidic community. And this community does not interact that much with the rest of the population. And they have a number of, they are rather in relation with other Hasidic communities in New York City, for example. So there are issues of synagogues that are kind of private synagogues that are created in apartment buildings, but that technically do not respect the local bylaws, zoning bylaws. You have buses of fellow Hasidic Jews coming from New York for a weekend with illegal parking and other citizens who suffer some inconvenience as a result of that. And obviously it creates tension. So there are citizens' forums that have been created so as to address these questions. And in that case, interestingly, there is even a Hasidic woman who is a municipal council. Actually, she was the first Hasidic woman to be elected in Canada at an official position. You have mediation programs, intercultural mediation programs that are created by municipalities so as to, again, promote convivencia. Training programs, support for specific groups' initiatives, so as to include, for example, young people. You have various citizen-induced initiatives. So it's not only the official administration of the municipality or of a particular borough that launches a particular initiative. It comes from the citizens themselves. And actually, it's interesting because this Hasidic woman, who is now a municipal councilor in Montreal, she was part, before being elected, she was part of a kind of informal group called Les Amis de la Rue Hutchison, Los Amigos de la Calle Hutchinson, and Outremont, with people, with Hasidic people, with non-Hasidic people, with atheist people, trying to find a modus vivendi together, irrespective of the action of the municipality. But it's important that municipalities do not hinder that type of initiative and that they facilitate that type of initiative. Last, and I will finish with that, so there are various initiatives that are worth exchanging, that are worth being examined, and I think it's important that municipalities around the world which are faced with the same type of challenge exchange between them. There was the Mayor's International Observatory on Vivre Ensemble, on Convivencia, was created a few years ago in Montreal by a group of cities. Madrid is part of that. But it's about Vivre Ensemble or Convivencia. They have elaborated, created forum where they exchange about good practices. And I think that we have a lot to learn from each other. But one thing that is very important when we're dealing with any source of diversity in our socially multicultural urban environments is to realize that there are intersections. Religion is one ground of discrimination, but there are other grounds of discrimination, and very often minority religious groups are also discriminated on other bases. And it speaks to civil and political rights, the importance of enforcing those rights, but also socioeconomic rights. As far as the immigrant population is concerned, and a part of the immigrant population in Canada is a religious population, well, they are often among the poorest people. They live in neighborhoods which are not easy. So you have to think about social, economic, and cultural rights as well, even though they are not justiciable. You cannot claim them before a court of law, at least in Canada. It's different in other countries. So we have to bear that in mind when we reflect on the potential action of municipalities with a view to promoting convivencia. Think about housing. Think about social development, urban planning, but not only through zoning bylaws. Think about policing. How do police officers interact with minorities? And again, it's a question of intersection. And let's face it, in Canada, as in many countries, right now, if you are Muslim, and if you are a Muslim woman wearing a veil, a hijab, your situation is not always pleasant. You are a victim of discrimination. You may be a victim of aggression. And people on the ground, police officers, security, have to be aware of that. They have to be trained to deal with these issues. They have to be trained to deal with other types of discrimination, but that type of discrimination as well. I don't want to leave you with the impression that the situation in Canada is terrible. Actually, we're doing, I think, overall, a relatively good job. And perhaps the embajadora she can contradict me, but I think that we're doing a rather good job. But there are issues. What is very important, as I mentioned, is that municipalities are very important actors. And the last thing that I want to mention about municipalities, and it's a Canadian problem, which probably is less likely to exist or to arise in Spain, but it speaks to the importance of dealing with First Nations people, Indigenous peoples. Right now, there are more Indigenous people living in large urban centers than on reserves in Canada. And unfortunately, many of them are homeless. Many of them have lots of problems. And there are, in many large urban centers, circles of Indigenous friendship, which not only seek to welcome these people who often come from afar and have a kind of cultural and social shock when they go down south. Yes, Canada can be south to some extent. So as to help them overcome their challenges. And the revival of Aboriginal spiritualities in those circles is one strategy among others. So again, relying on community groups, when you are a municipality, working with community groups is a winning strategy, or is likely to be a winning strategy. I will stop there. I think that I have covered most of what I wanted to say. I'm sorry, I forgot to follow up with my PowerPoint. I've always been very bad with this, and I haven't changed. But I guess you caught most of what I had to say, and I'll be very happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Jean-François. Yo creo que uno de los parámetros de la excelencia es tener la capacidad de, en poco tiempo, relativamente poco tiempo, poder combinar y ofrecer de modo claro claves desde el punto de vista histórico, jurídico, sociológico, político, y eso es exactamente lo que hemos escuchado en esta ponencia. Así que enhorabuena y muchas gracias por la contribución. Surgen muchas cuestiones, muchos debates, muchos posibles temas, pero yo antes de abusar del uso de la palabra, y porque creo, si no estoy equivocado, que tenemos unos 15 minutos más, ofrezco el uso de la palabra a cualquiera que está aquí en la sala que quiera formular alguna cuestión o hacer algún comentario. Sí, no sé si hace falta un micrófono. Sí, vale, está ahí.
Bueno, muchas gracias por la exposición. Bueno, me ha sorprendido la autocrítica. La autocrítica en el sentido de decir, creo que lo hacemos bien, pero hay problemas. Lo digo desde España porque para nosotros la gestión de la diversidad religiosa que hace Canadá es una referencia. Es decir, si ustedes lo hacen bien, pero tienen problemas, nosotros es que estamos bastante lejos de alcanzar eso. No, lo que me ha gustado es un poco centrar la cuestión en las políticas municipales. Es decir, creo que es algo esencial y muy importante. Lo digo porque Bueno, nosotros evidentemente tenemos unos acuerdos que hemos firmado con diferentes confesiones, los del 92, con judíos, musulmanes y evangélicos, y nos damos cuenta de que no solo nos implementan a nivel estatal, es que nos han implementado a nivel autonómico o a nivel municipal. Por poner un ejemplo, estos acuerdos nos hablan de la asistencia religiosa en las Fuerzas Armadas. Han pasado 30 años de los acuerdos, se cumplen ahora en octubre. En las Fuerzas Armadas solo hay asistencia religiosa católica, no hay ni musulmana, ni judía, ni evangélica. ¿De qué vale el acuerdo? De nada. ¿Tenemos problemas? Sí, porque, por ejemplo, los enterramientos dependen de los municipios. ¿Hay problemas de enterramientos? Evidentemente los hay. ¿Se aplican? No. Pero además hay otro dato que existe en España y no existe en Canadá. Y le voy a decir una cosa muy clara, y es la cultura de la diversidad. Cuando yo leo la sentencia del Tribunal Supremo canadiense, yo me encuentro jueces que tienen cultura de la diversidad. Y podría poner muchos ejemplos, ¿no? Desde el caso de Simpson contra Sears, que es el primer acomodo razonable, hasta el famoso caso del Kirpan. Hombre, es sorprendente cómo responde, por ejemplo, el Tribunal Superior de Justicia de Madrid cuando una niña de un colegio público que es musulmana ni siquiera pide comida halal, solo pide ser eximida de comer cerdo. La respuesta del tribunal es que es imposible armonizar eso. Pero es tan contradictorio que después de decir que es imposible armonizarlo, dice, por cierto, en Madrid hay centros que lo aplican, que se vaya a ese centro. Fantástico. Sentencia por unanimidad. Bueno, es para reforzar que me parece bien que sea autocrítico, pero lo sea menos, porque otros estamos por debajo y debemos ser más autocríticos. Gracias.
Well, if I might respond, thanks for your comment. Actually, it's very interesting. I can tell you, well, I'm a law professor. I'm an academic, so I'm critical by definition. I'm not a politician, so I'm not in the kind of Pollyanna mindset. But I think that we're doing a good job. But there are issues. Just to give you a further layer of information, with the secularization of society, obviously more and more people will not be able to ground their claims for reasonable accommodation on the basis of freedom of religion, because that would not be sincere. You know, they wouldn't meet the test. Now, freedom of conscience, and I just came from Cordoba, where there was, I was presenting on freedom of conscience at a conference on law and religion. Freedom of conscience is probably the next frontier as far as we are concerned. And you were mentioning the refusal to allow accommodations towards, well, not eating pork, not only having halal food, but I can tell you that the Federal Court of Canada a few years ago accepted the claim by a federal inmate, he was in a federal penitentiary, who was a vegan, on the basis of freedom of conscience, to be reasonably accommodated and to be given vegan food in the penitentiary. I think that this, and my hypothesis, although this is something that nowadays in Canada is a given. You know, we reasonably, there is always either a vegetarian or non-meat meal or option that someone who is Muslim or is Jewish, observant Jewish, can resort to if at the cafeteria or in schools. So that's not a problem. As far as your comment as to the openness to diversity of Canadian judges. Well, of course, we've been talking about diversity for quite some time in Canada, but at the inception of Canada, there was some layers of diversity that was recognized. And the fact is that there was people, Roman Catholic people who were mostly French, and then you had the Irish coming. But that was, in my view, the embryo of multiculturalism. Before multiculturalism, you had biculturalism, which was recognized. And somehow I think that even in the late 19th century, even in the early 20th century, when diversity was not very popular, when actually the mood was assimilating, well, this was not the main policy, at least at the federal level. It was at the provincial level, towards indigenous peoples, towards French peoples, for French-speaking people. But at the federal level, and judges had to deal with the Constitution that incorporated some protection for diversity, and particularly religious diversity, rather than linguistic diversity. So it took some time, and obviously Canada being a country of immigration, but nowadays, well, there's lots of migrants in Spain, there's lots of migrants in Italy, there's lots of migrants in France or Germany. But there's also, I must say, another, I would say, variable that has to be taken into consideration. I honestly think that the common law tradition, which informs the public law in Canada, even in Quebec, made a difference because it is much more based on casuistry. You look at problems from a more casuistic standpoint or perspective than the civil law approach, which is more relying on general norms, top-down approach. And it is resisted in some quarters. Right now, the debates about religion, how to handle religious groups, and multiculturalism in Quebec, because we're a mixed jurisdiction with private law, which is anchored in the civil law, so very general norms, and the common law as well. It creates interesting divisions, and very often those people, especially in the legal academia, who are the most prone to say, well, to be against reasonable accommodation, against that casuistic approach, would be civilian lawyers, while us, public lawyers who are more common lawyers, tend to be a bit more open to this type of reasoning. But so the legal tradition is a variable. And my last comment on this, the notion of public order. If you look at the scope of the notion of ordre public, orden publico, or public order in civil law jurisdiction, it is construed in a much broader way than the equivalent common law notion of public policy. And it tells you something because, for example, in France, well, the Conseil Constitutionnel has upheld, well, most of the laws prohibiting the wearing of religious signs on the basis of ordre public. It's not only laïcité at large, which is a constitutional principle, but it's also public order. The idea that people could react negatively and to a burqa, to a hijab, to a kippah, public order itself was one of the grounds upon which those legislations were upheld in France. And so it's the reaction that people may have when they see religious signs. So this broader notion of, or conception of public order versus public policy at common law might play a role. Well, this is an argument that I made in a paper that I wrote like 10 years ago. But I think it's a variable. When you look more deeply at the fundamental concepts of your legal tradition, you can see sources of blockade, so to say. Thank you for your comment and question. Gracias a usted.
Hay muchas cuestiones que han ido surgiendo y que se relacionan entre sí, pero Canadá nos da muchas pautas y muchas claves, pero aprovechando partes de la ponencia, se ha aludido a los acuerdos, a las convenciones de 1867, donde efectivamente se produce un equilibrio entre dos tradiciones religiosas. ¿Hasta qué punto un equilibrio constitucional puede justificar una diferencia de trato con carácter permanente? Cuando esa diferencia de trato empieza a ser discriminatoria frente a terceros grupos que empiezan a tener la relevancia social que tuvieron en aquel momento los católicos o los protestantes en el caso de Quebec. Obviamente me estoy refiriendo al caso Goldman, que el Comité de Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas consideró como discriminatorio por la financiación pública de las escuelas católicas en Ontario, no tanto porque hubiera financiación, sino porque esa financiación se extendía a otros grupos religiosos que ya tenían la raigambre o la presencia en otras minorías que ya tenían la presencia que podía considerarse que tenía la minoría católica en Ontario. Ligado con esto, en la ponencia has utilizado muchas veces la referencia a minorías religiosas El concepto minoría es algo que en España es más difícil de oír, no somos de esa tradición. En Francia sugiere reacción contraria, negación de la existencia de minorías. Pero yo sí creo que el concepto de minoría religiosa, contrariamente a la minoría lingüística, está abriendo una puerta a gestionar de una manera mucho más diversificada la realidad, porque es muy difícil poner una barrera en cuáles son las minorías religiosas que califican como tales y cuáles no. Es decir, puede acabar siendo minoría religiosa todo grupo asentado en el territorio con voluntad de quedarse, y si es así, ¿hasta dónde extendemos la protección? Y ahora mismo aludías a ello en cuestiones que no son tan directamente religiosas. Que yo sepa, la única Constitución europea que alude a un grupo minoritario que no es ese apellido religioso es la de Bélgica, que alude a minorías filosóficas e ideológicas. Solamente una. En todas las demás y en los tratados internacionales el adjetivo siempre es religioso. Y por último, no me resisto tampoco a plantear una cuestión un poco más política. Hemos aludido a la crisis de los acomodos, sobre todo en Quebec, por supuesto el gran trabajo de la Comisión Bouchard-Taylor, etcétera. Aquí también hemos tenido el placer de tener a Bouchard con nosotros, de poderlo escuchar directamente después de todo aquello. ¿Hasta qué punto realmente fue útil viendo la evolución sociopolítica posterior? Es decir, viendo cómo los problemas de convivencia, donde se exacerban, donde en fin, también Kimlich ha hablado mucho de esto, realmente es en los medios de comunicación. ¿Hasta qué punto ahora podríamos hacer una evaluación respecto a cómo influyó aquello? Son muchas preguntas, lo sé, entonces contesta libremente a la que te parezca más.
I will try to answer most of them. I may forget one, actually. I took note. Thank you. Very excellent question. Your first question, Eduardo, has to do, I think, with the Adler case, in which the Supreme Court of Canada rejected a claim made by Jewish parents that the Ontario government should be bound to fund Jewish schools as they fund Roman Catholic schools. And this points to a rule of interpretation which can be criticized, actually. I'm quite critical of it, but which is very well entrenched, I would say, in the interpretation of constitutional law of Canada, which is that one part of the Constitution cannot abrogate or reduce another part of the Constitution. And in the Adler case, the Supreme Court said, well, the reality is that it is differential treatment. The Roman Catholics in Ontario are favored over Muslims, over Jews, over whatever other religious group. But the special status of Roman Catholics in Ontario is constitutionalized. It's part of the deal that was made in 1867, and that the Canadian Charter of Rights and its freedom of religion guarantees, that it guarantees ex post facto cannot change. So basically you have watertight compartments, constitutional watertight compartments. But obviously, when it reached the Human Rights Committee, it was not bound by the Canadian Constitution. You know, the claimants had exhausted their remedies in Canada. It was not bound, but it is a doctrine of interpretation which I think should be revisited, but I'm just a law professor. So in French we say we are a gérant d'estrade. So we're like these people in the audience watching a football game and say, "Oh, the coach should have done that." So I'm just like that as a law professor. But I think there is a kind of incoherence, because if you say rights are important, well, perhaps you should reconcile and create a dialogue between different parts of the Constitution. But clearly, the Supreme Court does not agree. And in a few cases which are unrelated to freedom of religion, more to freedom of expression, it reiterated that approach. First question. Second question, you mentioned agreements that are, well, Canada has, well, in 1867, somehow Canada recognized in its constitution that minorities existed. And religious minorities, they weren't, the Constitution Act totally evacuated, the language question, which is nowadays the most important summa divisio in Canada, French versus English, in a context where you want to revive indigenous languages. But it's not in the Constitution Act 1867, and but there was an initial recognition that there are minorities in Canada. So somehow, again, there was this embryonic recognition that you have at some point to take into consideration potential asymmetrical power relations. And I think it participated in creating that kind of awareness to diversity issues, which took quite a long time to, I would say, blossom. But you had, I would say, the worm was in the apple. In other countries, like you mentioned France, France does not recognize any minority. Whether national minority, in the decision on the status of Corsica, the Conseil Constitutionnel said, well, no, it's not a nation. It's nothing. They are citizens. So it's different for outre-mer departments like New Caledonia. But if you are in a constitutional regime where the very existence of minorities is negated, denied, that obviously renders very difficult going further when it comes to other types of minority. As to I'm probably missing some parts of, but as to the questions of philosophical convictions, well, I mentioned the example of the vegan. In the Canadian context, obviously, the courts of law, I'm quite sure, will increasingly be faced by this question. So far, the Supreme Court of Canada has never decided a case on the basis of freedom of conscience. And as a matter of information, while since 1982, since the enactment of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, there are about 1,000 cases that have been decided by courts from all levels on freedom of religions. There are about 50 cases that have been decided partly on the basis of freedom of conscience. So there's a kind of legal vacuum there. What are courts going to do? And to the extent that a freedom of conscience is made and is coupled with the freedom of religion claim, the court will decide on the basis of freedom of religion because it is more self-contained, it is less amorphous, and its content is much easier to manage. So this is the next frontier. That's what I think that, and there is more and more literature on that in Canada, but as far as courts of law are concerned, it is really an area where the law will probably develop. You mentioned Belgium, and I think it's the same with respect to many European countries. The idea that governments from different levels may make agreement with religious communities. It assumes that there is an official community or an official representative for that community. We don't have that in Canada. So you can imagine situations where, for example, a municipality would try to create a dialogue with Hasidic Jews, but also with non-Hasidic but conservative Jews in another neighborhood. But we are not in a situation where there is a formal recognition of religious groups that are to be represented by, for example, the chief rabbi of France or the chief mufti of France. It does not exist in Canada. The approach is the legal approach is focused on, basically more individualistic. It is the individual claimants that make a difference, that make the law evolve, using the doctrines that have been elaborated and implemented by courts of law. That being said, in practice, on the ground, you have to be aware of differences, and I would say of differences within groups. One of my friends who was at the University of Toronto, Ayelet Shahar, she wrote very interesting books about power relations within religious communities, and she wrote about the paradox of multicultural vulnerability. So, for example, in some communities, some religious communities, within some religious groups, women are particularly vulnerable, and sometimes the husbands or the men will invoke freedom of religion to say, well, I have the right to do that. You have to address this, and you cannot treat the Jewish community, the Muslim community as one single entity. It is not. And because there is no official spokesperson, it is very Catholic Anglican. It's a very Catholic Anglican approach where you can say, well, in Roman Catholicism you have the Pope, and you have the cardinals and the bishops who can speak, about the official position of the church. You can deal with them, but you cannot do that with many other religions. So, but at the local level, you have to factor in those differences. And if there is an issue of convivencia in a neighborhood in Montreal or in Toronto between a minority religious group and non-religious groups or other religious group, you have to factor in those differences into the equation. So it's a very different logic. It's not about official representation and formalized representation of religious groups that speak for the entire community. And practically speaking, I happen to work with I would say the mainstream Jewish community in Montreal very often on various topics, and the CIJA, which they have barely any relation with the Hasidic community, and the Hasidic community don't even want to talk to the mainstream liberal Jews, and even conservative Jews who are not barely Jews for them. So it's it's complicated. Have I forgotten to answer one of your questions?
The last question was about the Bouchard-Taylor.
Bouchard-Taylor. Oh, yes. Okay. So, what happened? Well, the Bouchard-Taylor, it obviously had two major intellectuals. It was a very interesting document. And basically, they were recommending some action. Although there was no major problem, they were recommending some action. They were recommending, as far as visible religious signs were concerned, that state agents with a power of coercion should be forced to remove their religious garb, be it the kippah, the hijab. You don't have judges with big crosses anymore. It used to be the case. But anyways, this, I think, can be justified, and I would not be, if that type of legislation was challenged, this part could potentially be found reasonable because you have other examples looking at comparative law. That being said, the government, the then liberal government of the province of Quebec did nothing. It shelved the report. It only fueled the debate. And it's only my opinion, my view is that at some point you have to show some leadership. And if they had tried to implement some of the recommendations of the Bouchard-Taylor, perhaps, I may be wrong, perhaps it would have calmed down pundits, the population, the fears of some people. But now we are in a situation where not only through the Laicité Act, not only judges or police officers have to remove their religious, but all civil servants who do not exercise any coercive powers, and also primary and high school teachers. And it's a major issue as far as the freedom of religion. Obviously, as you perhaps know, the Quebec government, the Quebec National Assembly has used the Charter of Rights Notwithstanding clause to shield this law from challenges based on freedom of religion, and we'll see what the Court of Appeal, who will hear the appeal, but you have to be very creative in making a legal argument to circumvent that. But initially, I think that there was complacency by the government after the tabling of the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, which was a very reasonable report, and I don't think that, playing the ostrich game or looking under the rug or hiding under the rug when you're faced with these difficult questions is a good policy. And in practice, the debates are as live as alive and vigorous and as toxic as they were, even more toxic than they are. So that's my answer to the Bouchat-Taylor Commission.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Desafortunadamente creo que tenemos que concluir el acto ya. Y bueno, antes de concluir, por supuesto, quiero volver a agradecer al profesor Jean-Francois Gaudreault-DesBiens por la contribución, también a las personas que han hecho posible el acto y, por supuesto, a las instituciones que lo han organizado, Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales, la Embajada de Canadá, la Fundación Canadá, la Fundación Pluralismo y Convivencia, y por mi parte volver a agradecer también habernos dado la posibilidad de estar aquí, de disfrutar de este acto, y por mi parte nada más, muchas gracias.
Muchísimas gracias en primer lugar al profesor que nos ha acompañado esta tarde. La verdad que magnífica exposición, hemos aprendido muchísimo. Muchísimas gracias también a nuestro colega que ha actuado como relator y como moderador de la mesa. Muchísimas gracias a todos los que nos han asistido, con especial referencia a la embajadora de Canadá que nos ha visitado y a todos los que nos siguen también a través de los medios telemáticos. Esperamos verles muy pronto en cualquiera de los demás actos que celebramos aquí en el Centro de Estudios Políticos y Constitucionales, y esperamos también que nos visite de nuevo. Muchísimas gracias, hasta muy pronto.